Hello, and welcome to the very first edition of Progressum TV. As I explained last week, I completely rebranded this channel for the simple reason that I needed a name that was more indicative of the fact that I wanted to produce content in both English and Spanish. And I feel I needed a Latin name to do that, or some other term that would be universally recognized regardless of the language. So I came up with Progressum, and I think it gives a good hint as well as towards the ultimate objective of the political analysis of this channel, which is essentially a progressive channel. So I hope you like the new branding. I hope you like the new name. And the other big difference is that I am, for the moment, not streaming this. Why? Well, I feel really the point of streaming is when you have an active chat and you can engage with your audience. And since I'm just starting this channel, there's really no point to that. So hopefully the channel will get more subscribers in the near future, and hopefully we can do some form of audience engagement eventually, maybe do one stream a year. One stream per week, and keep building it up. I like streaming. It's actually, it's very fun to do. But it's also much easier to just pre-record this, and in case I mess up, I can redo it again. But I really want to do streaming at some point. So the format of this show, if you want to call it a show, will be the same. Every edition will have a short number, maybe 3 or 4 interesting news stories of the day, focused on global politics for the English version, and mostly Mexican and Latin American for the Spanish version. And I want to make it interesting. I want to give a macro political view of things. Not just recite the news, but give some insight of why this matters to the world. And hopefully also make it sarcastic, cynical, funny, because that wouldn't be me if I didn't do that. So to celebrate the fact that this first edition will be, that the rebranding is done to have Spanish and Latin American content, I will start the very first English stream with a very Latin American focus. And that's because this weekend there were 3 major elections in Latin America. There was the second round of the Ecuadorian presidential elections. There was the first round of the Peruvian general elections. And there was also local elections in Bolivia. I'm not going to cover the Bolivia ones because I have limited time and I want to focus on the 2 big ones. And let's start with Ecuador. Why? Because, it's the definitive one. It's the second round, and we now have a new president-elect, and that is Guillermo Lasso, who defeated Andrés Arauz by a relatively thin margin, not super thin, but around 5% of the vote. And this is quite shocking for various reasons. Now, those of you who know me and know my professional career, I was a Latin American analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit for 7 years. And during that time, we would constantly change our portfolios of countries that we covered. Some of us stayed with some big ones. I covered Mexico throughout most of that time. But unfortunately, Ecuador wasn't one of them. I never got the chance to be the Ecuador analyst, which is unfortunate because that means I really don't have a huge amount of context for what's going on in this election. So I'm going to speak with what I know, and I'm going to speak with what I think are the reasons why this was a very both surprising and not surprising result. Now, the context. Guillermo Lasso is a former banker. He represents basically the moneyed interest of Ecuador. He is your basically stereotypically neoliberal Latin American politician. He believes in free markets, free trade, privatization, and basically is the exact opposite of the type of economic policies that we were used to under Ecuador's long-standing leftist president, Correa, Rafael Correa. His rival, Andrés Arauz, is a former government official who served under Correa. He sees Correa as his mentor. He has been open about, by the way, more context, Correa has been accused of corruption and he's in self-exile in Belgium. Despite this, Arauz has made no secret of the fact that he is very close to the ex-president. Many people believe that Correa would have come back to the country if Arauz had won. I think he's going to he better be enjoying his life in Belgium because that's clearly not happening. Now, here's the thing. More context. Recent historical context. Ecuador has had a very troubling last couple of years economically. They have done really bad. And they have done really bad under Correa's successor, a man called Lenin Moreno. Now, you would think that a man called Lenin, running under the banner of the same leftist party and movement that Correa began, you would think that a man like Lenin Moreno would be just as left-wing as Correa. But in fact, that's not what happened. In a plot twist that is not necessarily new, there's been many cases of Latin American presidents who campaigned on very leftist politics, then ended up shifting to the neoliberal right once in power. I can give the example of Fujimori in Peru. I can give the example of Collor de Mello in Brazil. These were all very populist governments that took a very hard line. Like Fujimori, when he came to power, he was basically the opposition against Mario Vargas Llosa, who was very right-wing. You know, your standard elite, white, neoliberal Latin American candidate. Fujimori was supposed to be the antidote to that, and ended up being probably even more right-wing than Vargas Llosa was. So this is not the first time that it's happened. And Lenin Moreno surprised many by taking a complete shift to the right when he became president. He immediately became in favor of free markets, free trade. He most notoriously set up a deal with the IMF. Now, Correa had very strongly opposed the IMF during his time in power, and Lenin Moreno basically set up an agreement with the IMF, which was very unpopular. And overall, Ecuador's economy did not do well under Moreno. He was supposed to be fiscally austere, but in fact, the debt to GDP ratio skyrocketed. Many people were angry about his free market policies. There were some big protests back in 2019, in line with protests that also happened in many other Latin American countries. So Ecuador was sort of in that. And Lenin Moreno's popularity absolutely tanked. This was one of the most shocking declines in presidential popularity that you've seen in Latin America ever. Just how bad? Well, let's take a look. This is a group called Directorio Legislativo. They do a very interesting, I think it's a tri-monthly or bi-monthly survey of Latin American leaders. And what we'll see here is, guess who is, this is for February, latest one, January, February. Who is the most unpopular president in Latin America? That's right, Lenin Moreno, with an 8% approval rating, which is slightly higher than the 7% that he had sometime in 2020. 91% disapproval rating. That is insane. And he started his presidency being relatively popular. I think it was he had over 60%, something like that. So it is absolutely, and it's not even close. Like it's not even close. The next most unpopular, Sebastián Piñera, 19%. So over twice what Lenin Moreno has. So I mentioned Lenin Moreno because, again, I don't want to go off and say that I'm an Ecuadorian expert. So this is my personal take on why, despite the unpopularity of a man who basically shifted Ecuador's economic policy to the right, somewhat disastrously, because Ecuador was doing relatively well with Correa. And Latin America has a problem with some, basket case socialist governments like Venezuela, for example. But a lot of the the left-wing governments that came to power as part of the pink tide actually had very, very good economic performance. These countries grew faster than they did under right-wing administrations. Bolivia is probably a fantastic example of this. Even Venezuela under Chavez did really well. And this is a government that I strongly dislike for their anti-democratic tendencies, especially under Maduro, which is when the economy absolutely tanked. But the fact is that during most of Hugo Chavez's terms as president, the Venezuelan economy did really well, and Ecuador also did really well. But the problem is the original sin of Latin America's left is the inability to leave power. And people like Correa, people like Evo Morales, would constantly change the constitution to add extra terms and win. And they won, legitimately they won. But this is a question that makes a lot of leftists uncomfortable is, how far can your movement go when if it can't be a personality cult for the leader. I think Bolivia has a very good opportunity of proving this wrong with a return to a leftist administration after the coup d'etat that happened recently, and it's a great opportunity to see that the ideals of Evo Morales, who again was very successful, Bolivia has been a success story in almost every way, if it can continue under the leadership of someone else. And I think this is the lesson that a lot of Latin American leftists need to learn, that they need to know how to create a movement that lasts longer than the leader, because then you end up replicating some of the authoritarian tendencies that these same governments criticized that the right was guilty of back in the 80s, back in the 70s, when there were military governments that stayed in power with no elections. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think even though Lenin Moreno was no longer associated with Correísmo, the fact that he ran under the same platform, that he's part of the same party, to some extent tarnishes him and his party. And that leaves his successor, which is Andrés Arauz, who promises to return to the Correa style of policymaking. He still has to carry the weight of the fact that his party is to be blamed for the disaster of the last couple of years. And again, I'm not sure if this is like the definitive explanation, but the fact is that it certainly probably explains it. And Correísmo as a movement has now lasted probably longer than it should. But Lenin Moreno, to associate him with Correísmo and to affect the electoral prospects of a man who wanted to basically disown this shift in Moreno's policies, definitely didn't help Lasso. So again, Lasso's victory was marginal, but definitely, like, it's not up for dispute. 5% is definitely good enough, I would say. And this follows rather a surprise. So this was a surprising bit. He was trailing throughout much of the campaign. He obtained a somewhat narrow second place during the first round against an indigenous candidate, Yacu Perez. Now, I know when I say indigenous candidate, you're all going to say, oh, a fighter of social causes, but actually Yacu Perez is somewhat right-wing as well. So that may also explain why the vote for Yacu Perez actually might have gone to Guillermo Lasso. So there you have it. That is, I have another chart which, so this is right before the election itself. It says the latest polls show a technical tie in Ecuador's presidential race, and that is basically how. So the red is Arauz, Lasso is the blue, and you can see how he was clearly narrowing the gap before the election. I think they have a law where you can't do polls 10 days before the election. So you can basically see if the trend held, which clearly it did, by the time the election was held on the 11th. That gap was completely narrowed, and he overcame it. So I think that's a bit of a sad story. I don't think that someone like Lasso, who's already run numerous times, he's run numerous times for president, he's lost them. A continuation, it's strange because it is both a change in party, which you would think after a disaster is necessary to punish the party that led the country to a disaster, is warranted in this case. But in fact, it's just a change of party. It's just a change of the logo. In fact, the policies that Guillermo Lasso pursues are not that much different to those of Lenin Moreno. So we'll see what's in store with Ecuador, but I'm not really happy with this result. I think Correísmo deserved another shot under someone who wasn't Correa, and hopefully show that these hardline free market policies in Latin America don't really work out. So now let's move to Ecuador's neighbor, Peru. Now, Peru also held their general election. This was the first round, so let's be clear. We still don't know who's going to be the next Peruvian president. Now, Peru is a country that I did cover briefly for about a year or 2 years. I don't really recall. This was sometime, I think, like 2012, 13. And Peru is very interesting. Peru is a country that has one of the most fragmented political environments and party systems of any country in Latin America. And I think probably the world. You will struggle to see a country that has so many competing parties that actually have a shot of winning the presidency every single time. And that also, a party forms, then it sort of fades away, then another one forms, and pretty much new parties have a good chance of becoming of winning a general election in Peru, which is not the case in many other countries where you have very strict establishment of parties, and only 2 or 3 maybe have a realistic shot at winning a general election. That has been historically until quite recently the case of Mexico, my country. But yeah, Peru is the exact opposite. So once again, we have a trend here where the leftist. So the results of the first round here and I'm going to show you. This is the official Peruvian Electoral Institute. We have the leftist party Perú Libre under Pedro Castillo winning so far, and the election has still not been finalized. There's 81.2% of the votes counted, which is pretty much as close to statistically this can't be narrowed in any realistic way. Winning with 18.3% of the vote. That is insane. Imagine an election where you win with less than 20% of the vote. That's how fragmented Peru's political party system is. So Castillo had been leading the polls, and I think this comes as a surprise to no one. But the real battle is who would, and we know that clearly with no one able to manage 20%, there's going to be a second round, obviously. So really the election is to see who's going to be Castillo's opponent in the second round. And that's when things are going to get interesting. And the real battle here is number 2 is Fuerza Popular. This is a right-wing populist party led by Keiko Fujimori. She is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, Peru's notorious president/dictator/prisoner. And Keiko has been trying very hard to cement her father's legacy and obtain the presidency, and she runs on a far right populist movement. And you would think it's strange that a far right movement in Latin America is being run by someone of Japanese descent. There's a significant amount of Peruvians of Japanese descent, Asian descent in general, and Fujimori, to his credit, was the first president of Asian descent to win office in Latin America. But just because she's a minority does not mean she is any good. And again, the movement that she represents is basically Fujimorismo all over again. And it appeals to a lot of Peruvians because a lot of dictatorships in Latin America occurred at a time when there were guerrilla movements, terrorism, etc., and they used very undemocratic methods, including human rights abuses, to squash those movements. Fujimori is still to this day given a lot of credit by society, by the followers of Keiko Fujimori, for having essentially wiped out the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path. This was a Maoist terrorist group that was guilty of serious political violence. It was basically a mini civil war in Peru. They were guilty of significant amounts of political violence, bombings and terrorist acts in the cities. And Fujimori cracked down on the Sendero Luminoso and basically made it a non-entity. So a lot of people give him credit for that. At what cost? Well, that is really the debate, whether his switch to an authoritarian rule was justified. That's not the topic of this show. But I'll just mention that basically Fuerza Popular is a continuation of that. And the other party that was quite close, they've sort of, I think, when I first saw the first results last night, Avanza País was I think in second place, so they slipped to third. And Avanza País is a party that started as a left-wing party, but then shifted right, and their presidential candidate is none other than, drum roll, because you might have heard of him, Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto is a Peruvian economist who is, sadly, probably the most famous Latin American economist of the last 40 years. At least he's the one that has the most international recognition. And why is this? Well, he was famous because he I believe his first book came out in the 1980s, in the midst of the Sendero Luminoso crisis, that basically argued that the reason that Latin American countries were poor is because poor people didn't have property rights. If this sounds very libertarian, it's because it kind of is. So he argued that the best way to eliminate poverty in Latin America was to give poor people a legal title to their land. You know, whether it was a shanty town, whether it was a small rural parcel. His argument was that poor people were victims of exploitation because they didn't have secure property rights. Now, this idea, imagine, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, which was the peak neoliberal era. This was peak Washington consensus, peak free market and free trade. Clearly was gold. It was picked up by the IMF, and this is from an economist who didn't really have any academic background in terms of like publishing journal articles or have an academic career. He suddenly had the formula, the formula that all the other economists in all the decades before him hadn't figured out. And it was a formula that was very appealing for the World Bank, for the IMF at the time, for the Bill Clinton administration, for basically, everyone in the State Department, because it was basically a free market idea. It said nothing about having to redistribute money. It said nothing about public spending. It said nothing about all the things that usually contribute quite well to development, but was not the kind of things that the IMF or the World Bank wanted to promote at the time, arguably even today. So De Soto became something of a folk hero. He would cozy up to world leaders like Bill Clinton. He would speak at Davos. He was a hit. He was a huge hit. Bill Clinton once said, and I quote, Hernando de Soto is probably the most famous living economist in the world. That's how much he was hyped up. And unfortunately, the results of his policies have not really been that great. There's so much criticism of De Soto. There's many journal articles written about the failures of his ideas. I'm just going to summarize from an article here in Slate. And this was this is not like a recent retrospective of his work where you can see the failures even, in an even greater long-term light. This is written in 2005 when he was still hot stuff. So I'm gonna read some bits of this article because it explains very well why his ideas were so popular at the time. De Soto's vision of the third world is instinctively appealing. He sees industrious, entrepreneurial slum dwellers toiling with boundless ingenuity, yet living in homes and owning businesses that are theirs only by de facto possession and jury-rigged local agreements, not by de jure deed and title. De Soto calls all of this informally held property, quote, dead capital, because it can't be leveraged to produce growth. It can't be mortgaged because it lacks a proper title to guarantee it as collateral. So basically his argument is that if you give deeds to people, then they can use that as collateral for loans, and they can get loans for whatever commercial activity they want to do. And he points out the fact that the major source of funds for new businesses in the United States is a mortgage. So clearly what works in the US must work in a Peruvian shantytown in the outskirts of Lima. Well, apparently that's not the case. So here's some of the case studies that disprove him. In various parts of the third world, newly legalized squatters on the outskirts of cities are discovering that a property title supplies little of the benefit that De Soto projects. Government studies out of De Soto's native Peru suggest that titles don't actually increase access to credit much after all. Out of the 200,313 Lima households awarded land titles in 1998 and 1999, only about 24% had gotten any kind of financing by 2002. And in that group, financing from private banks was almost nil. In other words, the only capital infusion, which itself was modest, was coming from the state. Reports from Turkey, Mexico, South Africa, and Colombia suggest similar trends. In Bogota's self-help settlements, writes Alan Gilbert, a London professor of geography who has done extensive research on land issues in Colombia and other parts of Latin America. Quote, property titles seem to have brought neither a healthy housing market nor a regular supply of formal credit. This is probably because banks realize they don't stand to gain much from repossessing shanties in rotten locations. Duh. Faced with a massive surge in legalized but tenuous properties owned by poor people, banks have simply adjusted their criteria for lending, and in some cases care more about stable employment than a land title. Not only that, but the actual real estate markets in many of these shantytowns on urban outskirts are stagnant, which puts a serious damper on any potential gains on capital, live or dead. So, that's basically the gist of the, this is, like I said, a very libertarian argument, just based on an assumption that just because you have any form of potential collateral, that you're necessarily going to get a loan. And when you read about banking markets in Latin America, you'll realize that capital is hard to come by. And the poorer you are, the more it is. In many cases, interest rates are prohibitively expensive. In many cases, there just isn't access to banking infrastructure at all. And I would see why this is the case in many of the shanty towns. But even then, even the shanty towns are at least close to a city. But if you go to rural areas, it's definitely much worse. So what I find surprising about how De Soto's main idea became popular is there was just no empirical evidence to support it. It was based on a whim. If he had come out with 10 years of empirical studies on this working, then he would have had a case to push it as sort of the solution to poverty in Latin America. But this is one of the most the shocking case of just how blind global economic institutions were in the 80s, 90s, and noughties. This myth of how just creating markets was going to get people out of poverty. To have based an entire campaign, to have based all these efforts to promote De Soto's policies around the world with no empirical evidence, absolutely none, backing it up, is insane. And that is when you realize just how much of economics is an ideology. And how these institutions, with Ivy League PhD people staffing them, can just basically take a book from a Peruvian economist that says what they want to hear and think that this is a new model for development. That is insane. This article also gives another example of Cambodia. And this is even more shocking because at least the examples above are just, markets failing. But this is actually when you realize that poor people don't just suffer from lack of capital or lack of income or just lack of resources in general. They suffer from being at the mercy of direct exploitation, direct threats, and death. So I'm going to read the other bit. In places where real estate markets are buoyant, titles turned out to be quite a hot commodity. Too hot, in fact. In June of 2002, for example, the World Bank kicked off a several-year project to distribute over 1 million titles throughout Cambodia. In Phnom Penh, I should have figured out how to pronounce it properly. The capital, untitled land near the city center had been selling for about $20 to $30 per square meter over the past few years. Titled properties nearby have been selling for around 10 times that much. For a poor squatter in the middle of the capital city, the promise of a title would seem to be a road for riches. In practice, it's more like a sign taped to his back that says, "Kick me." In the 9 months or so leading up to Project Kickoff, a devastating series of slum fires and forced evictions purged 23,000 squatters from tracts of untitled land in the heart of Phnom Penh. These squatters were then plopped into dusty reallocation sites several miles outside of the city, where there were no jobs and where the price of commuting to and from central Phnom Penh, about $2 a day, surpassed whatever daily wage they had been earning in town before the fires. Meanwhile, the burned-out inner-city land passed immediately to some of the wealthiest property developers in the country. So there you go. Let's be honest. The titles that these people will get for their land, the fact that it's probably not much money, but for them it's enough to be able to be bought out. And developers will buy them out. And this is the essence of the imbalance of power between the owners of capital, landowners, developers, big businesses, and squatters. So De Soto's idea that suddenly just owning a title gave you any sort of protection or any sort of benefit to the land that you owned is ridiculous. But anyway, I want to talk about Hernando de Soto because I am clearly not a big fan of him in any way. And part of me is glad that he's not going to go to the second round, because I think if he became president of Peru, it would be disastrous. But whether I have to pick between Hernando de Soto and Keiko Fujimori, that is like asking me which of my arms I want to have amputated. I struggle. I would probably think that anything is better than far-right populism, and by that logic, Keiko's is a more threatening possibility for president. But I actually think it's a good thing that Keiko will make it to the second round most likely, and that is because it is far more likely that she will be unappealing to a larger sector of society than Hernando de Soto. And remember that in second round elections, it doesn't matter if you won the first round by a landslide, which by Peruvian standards, 18% versus 13% is kind of a landslide. But even if you win by a landslide or by a significant amount, the story can change completely. I mean, just adding the votes of Keiko and De Soto, that is more than what Pedro Castillo has. So if the right wing of Peru decides to band together, the odds that one of them will win are high. But having said so, I think I don't want to make any bets on it, but I do think that Keiko Fujimori will be more unappealing to a larger sector of Peruvian society than Hernando de Soto. So we'll see. We'll talk again when we know the outcome. And well, yeah, that's the story. That's your Latin American. That's your Latin American elections of the day. And we will now move on to the next story, which is COVID. So, COVID in Latin America. Latin America has been one of the hardest hit region, the hardest hit region in the world from COVID. I know that a lot of European countries have higher deaths per capita, but I just want to remind people that in Latin America, there is a much higher percentage of people who die outside of hospitals. There is much less reliable tracking of actual deaths. There is lower levels of testing. All that seems to suggest that the actual death counts in Latin America are undercounted relative to Europe. Now, everywhere in the world, there will likely be more COVID deaths than we have from the official statistics. That is true. That is true anywhere. That is true in Germany as it is in Bolivia. But clearly the scale of the difference in deaths will be much larger in a country that is less developed, and where there are more people dying outside of hospitals. How many people are dying out of hospitals? Well, I can tell you from Mexico's case, there were some studies that suggest 8 out of 10 people are dying outside of hospitals. And I'm pretty sure that that's a very similar level in most other places, because by Latin American standards, Mexico has a better developed healthcare system than many others. I'm sure Chile, Argentina, Uruguay probably have much better, but then the rest are probably as bad or worse. So if 8 out of 10 people are dying in Mexico, that's probably a similar number everywhere else. And recent studies have shown that the actual death count in Mexico could be as much as 2.5 times the official number. So again, taking that number and projecting it elsewhere, we're seeing some very, very, very shocking numbers. Now, Latin America has been suffering from an additional problem, which is the new P.1 variant that emerged in Brazil somewhere around Manaus, apparently, in late 2000, and now is considered to be the dominant strain in Brazil. Now, the P.1 variant, like similar variants that have emerged in South Africa and Britain, are known to be more contagious and possibly more lethal as well. Now, the difference of just how much more contagious that is will be seen in this chart. Here we see a comparison of how Latin American countries are doing with coronavirus cases. This is cases, not deaths. And we're seeing the impact of a third wave in almost all of them. Argentina, you can clearly see the spike. Colombia, Peru. Uruguay is extraordinary. This is a country that had hitherto done really well. In contrast, we see Mexico, which, despite some pretty bad government handling of the pandemic, is doing surprisingly well in terms of cases. Why is it that, and this is done with a vaccination rate that is slightly lower than Brazil or Argentina, to say nothing of Chile, which has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. I think something like half of the Chilean population has now been vaccinated, compared to only about 8 to 9% in Mexico. I think the number in Brazil is slightly over 10%, and Argentina similar. So most of the Latin American countries are in the 8 to 11% range of vaccination, except Chile. So why is Mexico doing so well here versus all the other ones? Well, the difference is, this might come as a shock to Brits who think that Mexico is in South America, but actually that's the reason. Mexico is not in South America. And that's why we're doing relatively well, because Mexico has been fortunate in not having any of the major new strains be the dominant one. So we're stuck with the good old vintage COVID, not the new and improved version. And the difference is huge. I mean, things got really bad in Britain the moment that the Kent strain became the dominant one, and we're seeing this effect with the Brazilian variant, which has affected all of Brazil's neighbors to some extent. And the news from Brazil right now, Brazil recorded a couple of days of they had more than 4,000 deaths. That is absolutely insane. These are levels that were only seen briefly in the U.S. The U.S. has a considerably larger population than Brazil. So in terms of deaths per capita, this is an absolutely shocking number. And the news that you hear is tragic. Hospitals are on the brink. I think in Latin America, again, the fact that many people die outside of a hospital they don't go and seek treatment, actually helps the hospital system survive. Because if everyone who got severely sick, went to the hospital, all of our hospital systems would have collapsed by now. No doubt about it. So the anecdotes. Everyone in Brazil now knows someone who's died. Just like the same here in Mexico. I think everyone knows someone who has died, and there seems to be no end to this. That is the shocker. So here's a 7-day average of deaths in Brazil. It went down a bit, but unfortunately that seems to have been short-lived. We're at over 3,000 deaths a day in terms of a 7-day moving average, which is crazy. And we've seen some slight decline in cases, but nothing suggests that, and another retick. So I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel unless the vaccination effort picks up significantly in the next couple of months. This is going to last. And a problem with Brazil as well is that a lot of young people now are getting sick, and I'm been seeing a lot of reports that a huge number of people right now who are in the hospital, who are intubated, are in their 40s or younger. So I've explained. I wrote a piece. I wrote a piece once for quite recently for the LSE blog, Latin American blog, where I argued that a lot of the reasons why Latin America did so bad during the pandemic is that Latin America has a third world healthcare system with first world health issues. So you have huge levels of diabetes, hypertension, basically all the risk factors of COVID Latin Americans have, even in young people. I remember the first Mexican who died of COVID, I think was 40 years old, and he was a diabetic. So young people have diseases that you should not be getting for another 10, 20 years at least. And that is contributing, I think, significantly to why there's been a rise in young people ending up with severe COVID. But there's another issue, and I think this is also a bit of a worrying one. And it's basically a huge reliance on Chinese vaccines. Now, Chile has done really well in terms of its vaccination because it has been something of a test bed for mass application of many of the Chinese vaccines. Now, it turns out, and there's been a recent report that even Chinese officials themselves have now admitted that their vaccines have low effectiveness compared to other countries. We know that Pfizer and Moderna have an effective rate of something around 95. We know that the Russian Sputnik vaccine has an effectiveness of over something like 91.6 or something. But the effectiveness for the Chinese vaccines is the ones that have had like major public studies done is only about 50 to 60%. And some of the others claim to be in the 70%-ish range, but it's questionable whether how believable those numbers are. Now, if we weren't in a situation where the pandemic is ravaging the world, if this was just a disease that sort of popped up here and there, you can get away with a vaccine that's 50 to 70% effective. That's probably good enough. But when you are in a situation where there is a huge number of daily contagions, that might not be enough. And here's the thing about Chile. Chile's, despite the fact that over 50% of the Chilean population has been vaccinated, their cases per day are still going up. Now, this could be for many reasons not related to the effectiveness of the vaccine. For example, it could be that these new cases are mostly young people. Young people who might be taking the pandemic less seriously now that they know that grandpa has been vaccinated. That is entirely possible that that's the main reason, and that they're not following the rules, that they're not socially distancing, that they're not wearing masks. I'm not in Chile, so I can't really comment on this. But that's a plausible explanation. I think it's plausible as well because the death rate has not gone up as much as the cases would suggest. It has gone up, indeed it has. They're now averaging 100 dead a day versus 70-ish a couple of months ago, 50, 60s early in the year. So it's gone up significantly, but not nearly as bad as during their first wave, when at some point it averaged up to 252 per week. So we got to put that in comparison. Cases are rising. Obviously, like in most countries, we don't really know, because there wasn't mass testing, we don't really know how big this part of the chart was back then. Probably much higher than what this chart suggests. But this is still telling. This should not be happening. And we haven't seen a similar phenomenon in countries like Britain, for example, which has a similar level of total vaccination than Chile. In the UK, we have seen cases drop massively in the last couple of months. The US has also seen cases drop significantly. Israel has also seen cases drop significantly. But all of these countries have been using other vaccines. So, again, I wouldn't ascribe weak Chinese vaccines as the only reason why cases in Chile are going up, but it may partly explain it. And I mean, it's the more vaccines, the better. That is for sure. The more options that we have means, especially that poorer countries that maybe won't be able to afford, say, the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, or who might, for whatever reason, not have access. Maybe they have friendly relations with China, and China will supply them with vaccines. So it's good that China is a major supplier of vaccines. I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing their efforts at producing them and distributing around the world. But at this point in the pandemic, it is worrying if they are not as effective as they claim to be. It is quite worrying, because any country that relies entirely or mostly on Chinese vaccines, if it turns out that they mostly have little better than 50% effectiveness, and especially if they don't, so that's the effectiveness of getting COVID. But there's also the issue of what's the effectiveness against serious disease. And the good thing about vaccines like Pfizer's, Moderna's, and Sputnik, and even AstraZeneca, is that apparently the risk of getting severe COVID is almost zero. We recently had a case of Argentina's president, Alberto Fernandez. He tested positive for COVID, despite having been vaccinated with the Sputnik vaccine. But, if you have a 91% effectiveness rate, that means that almost 1 out of 10 people will not be protected from COVID. But as long as they're protected from severe disease, that is good enough. So let's see what goes on. But I think there is a case to be made that countries should not put all their eggs in one basket. And now, for the final bit of today's show, the fun part. I came up with, I discovered a YouTube channel whose name basically tells me all I want to know about it. It's called Young America's Foundation. What is the Young America's Foundation? Well, They are an organization that basically, by their own words, taking up the torch of freedom. They are in a war for the soul of our nation. This is basically another Turning Point's US-like organization that wants to promote far-right populist, very conservative ideas, basically, Trumpism, to a young audience who is, foot soldiers in the culture war against the woke, postmodern, neo-Marxist social justice warriors. And as you can see from their front page, it's pretty much all, all culture war stuff. In fact, they even signed up the White House's resident white supremacist, Stephen Miller, for their campus lecture program. Now, if you're a conservative and you think that Stephen Miller is like good branding for your side, you're an absolute idiot. Like, you are, like, this is like a leftist basically taking Pol Pot as their icon. You would ridicule them to no end. So having Stephen Miller, who is a white supremacist, he is without a doubt a white supremacist, as part of your campus tour is ridiculous. So yeah, it's basically just high school, college propaganda. They're probably bankrolled by some libertarian billionaires, but they have a YouTube channel that has 500,000 subscribers, and they recently posted a video that caught my attention because it's called 5 Questions to Ask, quote, Democratic Socialists by Liz Wheeler. Liz Wheeler is she's on One American News Network, which is basically one of the mouthpieces of Trumpism. It makes even Fox News look centrist in comparison. That's how right-wing it is. So she has 5 questions to ask Democratic Socialists, and I'm a Democratic Socialist. So I think I'm a perfect person to ask these questions. So let's see what she says, and I will respond to every single one of these questions.
What I want to do today is I want to give you 5 questions to ask your liberal peers who've jumped on this democratic socialism bandwagon. 5 questions that destroy the democratic socialist platform.
I'm ready to be destroyed. Just ready. I'm ready to have my entire ideology dismantled by a member of One American News Network.
And then I'm going to tell you why it's important to do this and to know this. So let's start. Question number 1, to ask your liberal peers, what's the difference between democratic socialism and just good old regular socialism?
Of course. There we go. So, first she starts saying that democratic socialism is a fad. People are jumping into the bandwagon. But what conservatives always love is to then equate democratic socialism with basically the Soviet Union or every other basket case socialist government that has ever existed. Now, the reason that it's called democratic socialism is because it disowns the authoritarian tendencies of these previous forms of socialism. Democratic socialists do not want to replicate the USSR in any conceivable way. Democratic socialists are not fans of central planning, for example. They do not want to replicate Venezuela. So I suspect that a big part of her definition of democratic socialism, she'll want to move the conversation into describing democratic socialism as basically Stalinism or North Korea.
Define it. When government takes over the means of production and distribution,
Okay, so here we're starting with the absolutely wrongest definition of what democratic socialism is. So, the main definition, here you go. Repeat this to every one of your conservative friends. Democratic socialism is about democratizing the workplace and making sure that workers own the means of production, not the state. Our view of how society should look like is one in which businesses are owned by their employees. It is not a central planned state. It is not a one-party state. It is not one where the state owns everything. Although I'm pretty sure that you will have no opposition from most democratic socialists in that the state should have some role in the economy, basically as a provider of social goods like healthcare, education, and possibly extending that to other sectors of national importance like perhaps utilities. But that's it. We don't want the state to be making iPhones. We don't want the state to be making cars. We want workers to own those businesses. And there is a sufficient volume of empirical evidence that shows that worker-owned businesses work pretty much as well as capitalist firms. And in fact provide many, many other benefits. Workers are happier if they own what they produce. They are more resilient to crises. Why? Because you collectively decide how the company will deal with that crisis. In Germany, for example, during the 2008 and 9 global recession, German unemployment barely budged, in contrast to the United States. Why? Because American companies basically just laid off workers by the thousands or by the millions. Whereas German companies, even though they're not worker-owned, have a system of worker representation on boards. And they collectively decide that they can continue working in companies, say by working reduced hours and with reduced pays, knowing that this is a temporary measure that is being done so that their company can survive a major global crisis. That is why they're more resilient. And there are studies that show that worker-owned firms are more resilient to crisis than capitalist firms are. So that is the world that a democratic socialist wants to see. Not one in which the state owns everything, but one in which workers own most of it.
Government redistributes wealth. That's socialism.
So, here's the thing. Governments, even under capitalism, redistribute wealth. You pay some taxes, even in the most capitalist state. That is redistributed. Now, the government also redistributes money for the benefit of corporations. So, I would love it if Liz Wheeler had a history of advocating against business subsidies or any other form of government support to business. I'm sure she would want that number to be zero, not a single cent from the government to businesses. But conservatives never argue that. See, that's the good distribution for conservatives. When it's done for businesses, it's fine. When it's done for workers and ordinary people, then it's socialism. And that leads to the very same, a very famous quote that is now often repeated in situations that happen when there is this disparity between the amount of financial resources that companies get from government versus what people get. And that is socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. I'm sure she is a socialist when it comes to businesses.
Right? And when the government takes over people's profits through taxes and redistributes that money by giving away free stuff, that's democratic socialism. That's the same. The only difference is maybe, just maybe, in democratic socialism, the people choose socialism, and in regular old socialism, it's imposed on them. So, like...
Well, actually, that is a very important distinction, because democratic socialists believe that we can achieve power through democratic ends. We don't want it to reach the point where there is a revolution, because revolutions don't always turn out the way that they are intended. So democratic socialists largely believe that it is through electoral politics and activism and basically under democracy that we achieve this. Now, what Liz Wheeler fails to mention is that capitalism has been imposed in many countries through the use of force. All the governments that the US helped topple during the Cold War because they were turning socialist, they didn't vote. The last time I checked, the Chilean people did not vote for Pinochet. So it is apparently fine when capitalism is imposed unelectedly, and you have quotes from some of the major intellectual architects of neoliberalism, like Milton Friedman or Hayek, and they weren't really hugely in favor of democracy abroad. They were happy if capitalism was and free markets were imposed by force. So the argument that socialists are less democratic than capitalists is patently false.
The difference between murder and suicide, the same end, you're dead. Question number 2, where in the world has socialism ever worked? In Venezuela?
Of course. There is no case against democratic socialism that doesn't include Venezuela. For starters, like I said earlier in this edition, I am not a fan and I am not a supporter of Venezuela. I understand that Chavez did some good things, but especially after his death and after Maduro became president, Venezuela has been an absolute basket case that I think no leftist, no self-respecting leftist should feel the need to defend. That is not the socialism that we want, and it is basically an authoritarian state. Maduro is a dictator. Full stop. That's not debatable. So picking Venezuela might be a good argumentative recourse if you want to, own a tankie who will defend Venezuela to the last, because that's what tankies do. But I think most sensible democratic socialists would immediately say, hey, Venezuela is not what we want. In the same way that you would argue that any failing African country is capitalist, because they are. I mean, there is no, aside from a handful of countries, every single country in the world today is capitalist. So are you going to defend capitalism by pointing out Mozambique's economic performance? Are you going to say that Somalia is pretty much a libertarian paradise? There's hardly a state. I can pick whatever basket case country I want to make the case that capitalism is horrible, leads to death, leads to hunger. But I'd rather argue on more substantive ideological levels. And note that she still hasn't really argued in favor of the things that democratic socialists really want, which is, again, the employee ownership and the workplace democracy thing.
As we speak, people are fleeing that country because there's no toilet paper on the shelves. I read a story about a month ago about a little girl, I think she was 10 years old. She was in the hospital for an infection that we would have just run to CVS or Walgreens for an antibiotic and not even missed a day.
Okay, if I was American, I would not use the U.S. healthcare system in an argument against any other country's healthcare system. I mean, surely Liz Wheeler knows that every year in the U.S. there is something like, 40,000, 50,000 preventable deaths because of uninsured people? Is this really the healthcare system that you want to defend? Do you want to get the massive hospital or the massive ambulance bills that you don't have in many third world countries that have some semblance of universal healthcare that the US, the richest country in the world, can't seem to afford somehow? But I'm sure that that's not something that Liz Wheeler wants to discuss.
Of school. This kid landed in the hospital because there were no antibiotics available. And she only lived because the kid in the hospital room next door to her died. And his mom gave the little girl his leftover antibiotics.
So giving an tearjerker anecdote is always effective for people because they'll recite that. Like whenever someone mentions, if these impressionable college students get into a debate with their lefty peers, they're gonna bring that up. They'll be like, "Oh, do you know the case of the kid that didn't get antibiotics?" I personally hate arguing with anecdotes, but they're terrifically effective. And in that vein, imagine just how many anecdotes you can Google in 5 minutes of people who had something tragic happen to them under the US's mostly free market healthcare system. You will have no shortage, like absolutely no shortage of absolutely, cases that probably, almost border on human rights abuse. All the more shocking because, again, the US can afford healthcare. They can afford universal healthcare. And these are stories that you will never hear in Britain, in France, and Sweden. You're not going to hear those stories. And if it's not just the people who died, not those 40,000 or so preventable deaths, what about the people who end up bankrupt and lose their capitalist dreams because of just, randomly getting cancer or some other very expensive disease? Again, that doesn't happen in Britain. That doesn't happen in France. That doesn't happen in Sweden. But you will have no shortage of anecdotes. So if you are a lefty and you're always compact with anecdotes to a debate, that's all I'm saying. Whenever you're debating a right-winger, always come to battle with a few anecdotes. Because then you'll just, facts don't always get to people the way that anecdotes do. When the Brexit debate was going on in Britain, you would hear a lot of the Remain crowd give, a ton of facts and figures of why the UK would be better off in the EU. And then the Brexiteer would just tell this story about a poor fisherman somewhere, good old British bloke, who for some reason no longer has fish because the evil French fishing boats have fished all the fish. And that's effective, like very effective. So an advice from someone who really likes debating and is quite good at them, always bring anecdotes.
In Cuba, in the universal healthcare system there, you have to bring your own light bulbs and blankets to the hospital. The surgical instruments are rusty, and the elites fly to Western nations for their medical care. And then the left's favorites, when we say Venezuela and Cuba, they scoff and tell us that that's not going to happen here.
So Cuba has one of the best, some of the best healthcare outcomes in the world, and probably comparable to the U.S. Maybe not the world. I probably overstated that because they have had an embargo, and that embargo is pretty much the reason why they don't have nice, clean, shiny instruments. Having said that, that's probably not the case. I'm pretty sure there are like rural clinics that have bad instrumentation, but you cannot achieve fundamentally good outcomes on say life expectancy if it was as bad as she paints it. And even then, there's other Latin American countries, Costa Rica, which also has a close to a universal healthcare system, I think has a higher life expectancy than the US now. So I would, if I was a conservative, I would not use healthcare to defend capitalism, especially not US healthcare.
Point to Scandinavia. Guess what just happened in Denmark? They canceled their universal basic income experiment because it didn't work.
Okay, first and foremost, that was not Denmark, you idiot. That was Finland. Finland had a universal basic income experiment. And guess what? It didn't fail. In fact, here's an article from, I'm trying to find the least biased source that I can, because obviously if I quote a leftist source, then they'll say, oh, you're biased. So I'm going to quote McKinsey, which has clearly no major incentive to defend universal basic income. And here's an article from McKinsey, which describes what happened in Finland. And here's the thing, here's the two takeaways. So one of the reasons that this experiment was done, and it was cut short, unfortunately, but one of the major reasons this experiment was done to see what was the response with employment. Now, one of the major arguments against universal basic income is that it's supposed to be, at least this is the argument that the right gives, it's supposed to be again, an incentive to not work. So if you're giving people free money, they're going to be lazy, they're going to play video games all day, and they're not going to work. Well, guess what? Turns out the basic income experiment in Finland actually had a positive impact on employment. People on the basic income were more likely to be employed than those in the control group, and the differences were statistically significant. So here's the thing: the people who have criticized the Finland experiment and who have said that it's a failure have twisted this argument, and they've said that, oh, we were actually expecting a major improvement in employment. But that's not what they argue when they're arguing against universal basic income. You're arguing that people won't work. So when you have an experiment that actually does the exact opposite of what you're claiming is going to happen, even if it's minimal, that is a success. That sounds like a success to me. And here's the other part. There was a huge boost to well-being. Why, of course, if you don't have to worry that much about money, a lot of your mental health issues are probably going to improve. A lot of your life satisfaction issues will improve. People underestimate just how much, in an age where there's an increasing acceptance of mental health issues, there's still not nearly an acceptance of what your job has to do with this, and what money has to do with this, and what living in especially in countries where you have a very hyper-capitalist environment where it's basically dog eat dog. Everyone's out for themselves. Everyone's trying to kick each other's ladder from under them. If you live in these kind of conditions, you're more likely to have mental health issues. That's a fact. So this, to me, even if employment had slightly fallen, if there was a huge improvement in mental health and well-being, I would think that this made the experiment worth it. So employment, well-being, two big issues. It was a success. I mean, I'm not sure what the critics of this experiment wanted to see. Did they want everyone with the universal basic income to get a job? I mean, clearly that wasn't going to happen. But it's the fact that they didn't work less that I think is proof that the experiment was a success. But then what do you expect when someone can't even get the country where it happened right?
It's shocking, right? In Sweden, they turned their economy back towards capitalism decades ago when socialism was threatening to tank their entire country, their economy. And the Soviet...
So that is partly true. Sweden definitely took a right-wing shift over the last couple of decades. But guess what? even right-wing Sweden is a level of welfare state that she would find unacceptable in the US. Completely unacceptable. So you're simply praising a country from being left to slightly less left by your own standards. So this is I would love it if she's praising Sweden, if she's praising Sweden's current economic model. Well, why doesn't she advocate exactly those things in the US? Of course not. Because even that system would be unacceptable. It would be socialism for her. If post free market Sweden was to be applied in the US, it would still be socialist to most American conservatives.
Soviet Union, there is no better example of socialism than the Soviet Union. People used to stand for hours in line for a loaf of bread, and they ended up, you can see photographs of this in history books that the left does not want you to open. You can see photographs of them eating their own shoes. Because
yeah, apparently everyone in the Soviet Union ate their shoes. Again, she really needs to actually read a history book, because that is not the case. So the USSR had a central planned economy. It went through rough times in the 70s and 80s, which is part of the reason why communism basically imploded. But it was still a level of affluence, first of all, much, much higher than during pre-communist times, so during Tsarist times. So there was an improvement there. And the Soviet Union, by the standards of, say, the Third World, was still considerably more affluent than the Third World. There was no starvation. People had, their basic needs met. Central planning is inefficient. That's why there were queues. For many basic goods, the market is still the best way to allocate resources. There is no doubt about it. And I think most democratic socialists will not disagree with that view. But the anecdote of eating shoes is probably based on the hunger in the Ukraine during the 1930s. This was when Stalin forcibly collectivized much of the Ukraine's agricultural sector, led to a massive famine. A lot of the millions of people that died, that are blamed on Stalin, happened because of that famine. And there were anecdotes that people would boil shoes in stew. So I think that's what, that's the specific anecdote that she's referring to. But she's trying to paint it as if this happened normally, as if, a worker in Leningrad would get home and, oh, there's a massive queue in the corner, I'll just eat my shoe. And that's ridiculous.
otherwise they would have starved. So where has socialism ever worked? Nowhere. Everywhere it's tried, it's brought oppression, starvation, and death.
So again, she's trying to define democratic socialism, which hasn't been applied yet. In the same way that, for example, libertarianism hasn't been applied anywhere in the world. And I've often heard critiques of libertarianism focus on that fact, and I think that's really a wrong way to argue against libertarianism. Just because a system hasn't been adopted anywhere does not necessarily mean that it is wrong. I mean, you can criticize libertarianism in every other conceivable way, but not because it hasn't been applied anywhere. So the same thing with democratic socialism. Now, democratic socialism has not been applied everywhere on a sort of national scale, but like I said, there are democratic socialist firms. There's a huge history of worker-owned enterprises in the U.S. and everywhere in the world. In the U.S., there are mostly small firms, but in other parts of the world, they can be big. In Spain, you have the Mondragon Corporation, which is a collective of many firms organized under democratic socialist principles. It's a worker-owned collective, and they're one of the biggest firms in Spain. So they're doing pretty well. If you ever go to London and you're walking around Oxford Street and you see John Lewis, and you walk into John Lewis and you see this glitzy department store that looks just like every other big glitzy department store that you've seen around the world. Well, guess what? John Lewis is a worker-owned firm. So if one of the biggest retailers in the UK can be a worker-owned firm, then the model pretty much works elsewhere. So there's evidence to show that democratic socialism works. Again, it has not been applied on a national level. But the few instances where it has worked gives one reason to hope that it will work one day. For the same reason that there was a point where capitalism also didn't exist. And capitalism didn't work until it did.
And that brings us to question number 3, the bridge between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's democratic socialism and regular old socialism. Who pays for all of that free stuff that she's promising? I mean, it would be great. I'm not going to lie. If you look at what she's promising, who wouldn't want to have all of that disposable income, someone else paying for everything that you're doing? But
So who pays for the Trump tax cuts that blew a massive hole in the budget? Who pays for the U.S.'s military budget? Who pays for the U.S.'s wars abroad? Republicans never ask who pays for the policies that they want to fund, regardless of how ridiculously expensive they are. And Republicans claim to care about the budget, except they don't. And if you look at the chart of which party in the US leaves office with higher levels of debt, it's always Republicans. Why is that? Think about it. Why is that? Clinton left office with a budget surplus. And what did George Bush do? Go to war and blow it. This is one of the most insane arguments. Like whenever there's a poll, right wingers always seem to have greater trust on economics, and yet there is absolutely no evidence that they are better at running the economy than Democrats. It's just crazy. So this argument, who's going to pay for it? I can go on another rant of argue why actually deficits and debt in the U.S. are not that important. But Republicans, especially hardline Republicans, like anyone like Liz Wheeler, should never use the who pays for it when she probably supports all the trillions of dollars of waste that Republicans support.
who pays for it? I know, Wall Street, the top 1%, that's what she says. But even if you tax the top 1% at a 100% tax rate, it still would not pay for all the free stuff Bernie and Ocasio-Cortez are promising people. So what happens then? Well, you tax the rich, and once the rich aren't rich anymore, you tax the kind of rich. And once the kind of rich aren't kind of rich anymore, you tax the middle class. And once the middle class have been taxed to the point where they aren't the middle class anymore, well, then everybody's equal, right? Isn't that what we were going for? Equally poor, and the government is in charge of all of your money.
Oh, this is adorable. So Liz Wheeler has clearly not heard of marginal tax rates. Let me explain what a marginal tax rate is. Marginal tax rate means that the tax rate that you are paying is after a certain amount of income. So when you say that you're going to tax... So when you have a marginal tax rate, which pretty much is universal, the 1% will never pay 100%. Like, you will never pay that. Even when there were marginal tax rates of 90%, that's still only applied after a certain income. Say, I don't know, $2 million. That's when you start paying 90%. And you pay a lower rate down. And then there's a point where you don't pay anything at all, because you don't want, poor people to pay the same amount of tax as a rich person. Now, taxes are one way in which you pay for all this, and I would say it's the main way. And the US is definitely not a country that taxes its rich enough. So there's a lot of leeway where you can get this money. But again, it's not the only resource. And taxation will not make rich people poor. if Bill Gates is taxed 90% or Jeff Bezos is taxed 90%, they're still billionaires. Okay, this is basic math. This is very simple. So even if you go to those levels of taxation, you're still not making the absolute rich not be rich. So it's preposterous, this argument that you're just gonna, keep taxing down until everyone's poor. But it sounds passionate.
So question number 4, what's going to stop democratic socialism, if there is a difference, from turning into regular old socialism? Nothing. They cannot identify a line or a mark on this continuum of socialism that would stop it from moving from one end of the spectrum to the other. Once you give the government the power to tell people what to do, once government has the power to take our money.
Do you mean the power to not give women the right to have an abortion? That kind of power? Because conservatives are not against government power when it comes to women's bodies, when it comes to any other socially conservative policy. They want to make it into law. They want to, they want to apply it universally. So they're quite happy of using the government to do that. So to answer her question, really what the line is, well, that's where the democracy part comes in. That's why it's democratic socialism. That's why no one's calling for a one-party state, like the Chinese Communist Party or the Soviet Communist Party. That's not what democratic socialists want. If you cannot understand that line is a really big one, because even in a country like the US, even when you had the most authoritarian-minded president in recent history, in Donald Trump, there were still sufficient democratic institutions to not turn the US into a dictatorship. And I swear that that's what Trump would have wanted. If he could have had absolute power, he would have wanted that. But the institutions of democracy prevented him from having that. And it's precisely those same institutions of democracy which actually work better when there isn't an economic elite bankrolling politicians, lobbying with billions of dollars every year for politicians to serve elite interests. Guess what? That's more democratic. A democratic socialist government in the US would be more democratic than what you have now.
And give it to somebody else. Once the government has the power to tell us what our fair share is, it's just a matter of time before it's full-blown socialism.
So why is Sweden less socialist now than it was? I mean, because Sweden was clearly at a level of socialism, and Sweden has never been socialist. Let's be honest. These are still fundamentally, even the Nordics are still fundamentally capitalist societies that have elements of socialism in them. So that's why they call them mixed economies, because they have capitalist ownership, which I think is the basic building block of capitalism. When you have capitalist ownership, you are capitalist, period. But they have a degree of, social institutions are state-run, like the healthcare system or education. Or even when they're not state-run, there is some provision by the state to give people access to these things for free. And you have governments, and this is one of the key points of the Nordic model, is that you had governments who were very much in favor of having a unionized workforce. So even though they were still capitalist, government supported unions, and relationships between workers and businesses were much better in these countries because they had strong unions. And there's a reason why many of these countries actually don't have minimum wages. There's a huge debate in the US about a minimum wage. A lot of Nordic countries, I think, I could be wrong, but I think none of the Nordic countries have a minimum wage. And many continental European countries only recently established the minimum wage. I know Germany, I think, very recently established the minimum wage. Britain, which was more of a welfare state than it was now, but they established the minimum wage, I think, in the 90s. So why don't they, if they're so socialist, why don't they have minimum wages? Because they don't need it. They don't need it because workers have access to collective bargaining, and that keeps wages at an acceptable level. So again, what has stopped? Why is Sweden not a proper communist country by now? Why are they not a new USSR? Why is Denmark and Finland or Germany? This is a slippery slope fallacy, and it's called a fallacy because if you have no argument other than, well, what stops them from coming? Well, many things. I just explained. Many things stop them from becoming authoritarian. In fact, it's the more capitalist countries that tend to become more authoritarian. Because if not, Europe by now would be entirely communist, and it's not.
And so question number 5 is a question that it's a bit surprising to me that the left doesn't ask. And I'm not talking about the radical leftist politicians. I'm talking about the voters. Why on earth do they not ask, why would we want that here? We all want fairness. Everyone in this room, I think, wants fairness. We want every person to get a fair shot and a fair opportunity.
That's not fairness. I could start on a rant of giving a Rawlsian explanation of what fairness and justice is, but I won't because this is not the time, and I'd spend half an hour talking about it. But Republicans don't like fairness. They like the idea of meritocracy. They like the idea of rags to riches because that's part of the American dream. That's part of the mythos behind the U.S. But in fact, social mobility in the U.S. is really poor. It's one of the worst in the Western world. So there is no such thing as this equality of opportunity without any element of equality of outcome as well. And this is you will not convince right-wingers on this point. You just won't. They're fundamentally opposed to the idea of anything resembling equality of outcome. But that's the fact. Equality of opportunity does not lead to fairness. This is statistically, empirically proven. And even this idea that the US is a society where you have equality of opportunity is preposterous. And you hear it, because you hear stories of, an immigrant family. And this is when Republicans like immigrants, when they can give a story of how they came from a poor Central American country and now they're a small business owner, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, you're making a comparison between the richest country in the world and a Central American country. That's hardly, clearly you are more likely to make it in the US than in Central America. But it's when you compare the US with countries similar in income with it, when you realize that the US actually isn't that good at social mobility. It isn't that good at meritocracy. The American dream is just that, a dream.
But in the past 100 years, 100 million innocent people have been killed by socialist and communist governments and regimes. Is that what democratic socialists want to happen here?
A kind reminder that the grand majority of terrorist killings and sort of politically motivated violence in the U.S. is now done by right-wingers. In fact, it's overwhelming. Leftist, Antifa isn't murdering people the way that alt-right and neo-Nazis are. That's a fact. So she should explain the political violence on her side. She should explain political violence in her country rather than use examples of countries halfway around the world with different historical circumstances. If she's arguing about ideology in the US, she should be arguing about who is committing violence in the US.
So you guys know all of this stuff, right? Right, you know all this stuff. You know socialism is one of the deadliest ideologies the world has ever known. You know there is a difference between giving somebody a hand up and giving somebody a hand out. Because a handout means you have to steal what's in your hand from somebody else's hand.
Well, that was... I'm never going to get my lost neurons back. That was ridiculous. But this is the kind of things that if you're a young, impressionable college or high school student who wants to be an edgelord because you hate SJWs, that's the kind of discourse that you listen to and you think it resonates. Unfortunately, it resonates. But it's ridiculous. And these people will never, like, she will never go and debate this with AOC, who she mentions. She will never go and debate this with Bernie Sanders. She will never debate anyone with any working knowledge of socialism or history, because then you would realize just how vacuous and empty this criticism is. So, dear Liz, maybe I'll upload this to YouTube and copy it on Twitter and tag you, because I think I've answered your 5 questions pretty well. And maybe I should ask 5 questions to ask Republican capitalists. I'm sure she would struggle to answer them. Anyway, on that note, this was the very first episode of Progressum TV, and I hope there will be more of them. Please do me a favor and like and subscribe and share, because there'll be more. And if you like this video, you'll like what's coming. Thank you very much, and see you next time.